Hello folks, Dick Fairburn here. I want to talk to you today about a toy that I have. I've said in a couple videos that I don't really collect guns. I don't really have guns just to go play with. That in the course of my life, my guns have almost always been tools. Something that I have a legitimate need for. But I have to admit that I do have a couple of toys. And one of them is an M1 Garand. This is what George Patton described as the greatest battle implement ever devised. The technological advance we had in small arms for the individual soldier in World War II was really a couple of decades ahead of the rest of the world. And no single thing that we'd used in World War II really won that for us. But I really think the M1 had a major part of that. So I'll tell you a story about the rifle I got, how I got it, and if you think that might be interesting, stick around, because we'll get started here in just a minute. When I was a young officer in Wyoming, worked for a sheriff's department, 3 patrol deputies total, so awful lot of square miles to cover. We were some of the earliest cops out there to have rifles in our vehicles, and all 3 of us were avid rifle shooters. Our captain, the senior patrol guy, was retired from Cook County Sheriff's Police and had not only been on the very ground floor of putting together SWAT teams in this country, he was also an Army Reserve warrant officer in the human side of military intelligence. And he had done a number of short tours in Vietnam. So this guy had been in a number of firefights, both in the military and in his days in Cook County, Illinois, which is Chicago. So we talked the sheriff into letting us carry rifles. We found out that, like an AR-15, they had back then they had the triangular handguards. The long round ones were just starting to appear. But with those round handguards and a little bit of modification, we could get them to fit into an electric shotgun lock. The odd man out was my buddy Mark. He had an Heckler & Koch HK91 308 caliber, and we managed to get it racked up on the dash, locked up as well. So we had rifles with us. My AR-15 put down countless small to medium-sized animals, hit by cars, attacked by coyotes, a lot of different things. But I thought, gee, I ought to have something bigger in the back end. Mark and Dan both carried scoped bolt-action hunting rifles back there in case they needed something beyond, iron-sighted AR. And I had found out as a firearms instructor that through the Director of Civilian Marksmanship, which at the time, that was an arm of the Army, and they sold these surplus weapons. The DCM has since gone away. It's been replaced by the CMP, the Civilian Marksmanship Program, which they're not Army employees. It's my understanding they're kind of like the Red Cross. They're a government authorized entity that surpluses out military property. At the time, you had to be a high-power rifle competitor with 2 or 3 shoots in your scorebook to be able to buy an M1 from the DCM. But we found a clause that if you were a law enforcement firearms instructor certified as such by the NRA, you could buy one. And the sheriff, the captain, and myself all had those credentials, so we did the paperwork, we sent it in. Cost $165 back then. They're a lot more money now from CMP. And you didn't have a choice of what you could get. CMP has different grades that they sell out, and the true collector grade rifles go out on auction now for because they're just worth so much more than asking price. But at the time we got ours, you got a rack grade arsenal rebuild rifle. And you didn't get to pick anything about it. That's just the way it came. And the sheriff showed up first. He got a Springfield Armory. He knew so little about the M1, he didn't even know what caliber ammunition to go get to fire in it. But he thought it was cool. The captain knew M1s very well. And he got a Winchester, which was what he wanted. It tickled him. And mine seemed to be delayed 2 or 3 weeks. So we're waiting and we're waiting and waiting. And finally I get a note in my post office box that says, hey, come to the desk because we got a package for you. And they mailed them to you. Took it across the street to the sheriff's office, cracked the box open in the conference room. We were all gathered around, and I got an International Harvester. Now, I had known that International Harvester made some M1s. Didn't really know much about where or when or other things about it. But I grew up in a town in Illinois that had an International Harvester plant. They didn't make the rifles here, but they did make some trucks, some trailers. IH also made a lot of shell casings, and not only shell casings, but the casings for artillery rounds. So they had an experience of working with military procurements, and after World War II, IH was contracted to build M1 Garand rifles. It never really built rifles, and they turned out to build a pretty good quality product, but they had a lot of growing pains to get up and running with it. And in the end, awful lot of other parts were included in those International Harvester rifles. But it tickled me. You know, I grew up in an IH town. My dad worked at the International Harvester plant for a few years after he came back from World War II. So that connection was pretty special. As I researched into it, what I have discovered, and it's kind of interesting, I'll talk about it as we go along here, these are not collector grade rifles, the ones that we got originally from the DCM, which is fine for me. I don't want a collector grade rifle. I'd be afraid to go out and break something. I want a shooter. And as a shooter, it's phenomenal. It works really, really well. It's never missed a lick. It's adequately accurate. I mean, these are not tack drivers. They never were. But as a battlefield implement to 200 or 300 yards on a man-sized target, they're in trouble. And it's going to give you 8 rounds. It's going to work every time. That's the thing about them. So the contract with the International Harvester ran from about 53 to 56. So these were not even Korean War production. It was after Korea that International got these contracts to build the M1 Garands. They eventually built 337,000 of them. But as I said, very few contained all International Harvester made parts. This is an arsenal rebuild. We don't know when it was rebuilt, but probably in the 60s sometimes. A lot of the Internationals ended up going overseas to the Philippines, to Turkey, when we did kind of lend-lease operations with military hardware with those companies. And then a lot of them, you know, part of the deal was when you're done with them, you got to send them back. A lot of them came back during time frames when they could not be sold to the public, but a lot have. And in fact, just recently, I think a lot of them came back from the Philippines and are now going through that CMP process to be restored to, you know, working condition and essentially arsenal rebuild. So there's going to be a supply of these through DCM, or excuse me, from CMP for probably a long time. There was a really good article that came out, the Rifleman magazine a couple of years ago, that talked about the International Harvester. And what I found was the serial number of my rifle was made in 1953, so it's 2 years older than I am. The receiver was actually made, or at least roughed, forged and roughed by the Springfield Armory. And then it was finished and stamped as an International Harvester receiver. That's the only international marked part in the rifle, and it was actually made by Springfield Armory. So really the only thing this International Harvester company about this is the stamping on the receiver. But hey, it says International Harvester, and I can tell you, gun guys in my hometown, a lot of them have spent years and substantial sums of money to try to come up with an M1 marked International Harvester because, you know, we had one in our town. So it had a Springfield IH receiver. The barrel is marked LMR, so that means it came from Line Materials in Alabama, I believe, and they supplied a lot of barrels both during and after World War II for the M1s, and virtually all of the IH rifles had LMR barrels. The trigger housing is a Winchester, the hammer, Springfield Armory, the bolt is a Harrington Richardson, The safety is a Springfield Armory, and the op rod has no maker marks on it that I can find, but on top it's stamped NM, which means it's a national match grade operating rod. And interestingly, the bottom of the receipt, if you pop the trigger group out, there's actually a couple of milled areas on the bottom of this wooden stock that are filled full of epoxy bedding compound. So apparently both the op rod and the stock were parted out from a national match grade rifle. Little history of the M1, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of YouTube videos. My research source for a lot of this is a book called Hatcher's Notebook. You can find it online out there. I think it's probably out of print, so the prices are starting to go up. Mine is years and years old. I bought it new when I first started getting interested in guns. If you want to know about a lot of the World War I, World War II evolution of our military weapon systems, you need to get a copy of Hatcher's Notebook. John C. Garand devised it. He was a Canadian who emigrated here to the States when he was about 10 years old. He pronounced his name Garand. The rifles are typically called Garands. I think it's, Garand may be improper, but it's kind of interchangeable. It was originally built in a 276 Pedersen cartridge, and the end block clips for that smaller diameter cartridge held 10 rounds. And also, instead of a gas port, it had kind of a muzzle device that caught gases as the bullet exited the muzzle. And there are still a few of those gas trap rifles out there in the hands of collectors, but eventually it was changed to the gas port that we see now. The rifle was finished. It was submitted for approval in the 276 Pedersen caliber, and the Army Chief of Staff at the time was Douglas MacArthur, and he said, no, there is no reason to change from the same round we use in machine guns and everything else, so he nixed the 276. The rifle was redesigned for the 30-06, the standard cartridge. That became what we know now. A lot of people will tell you that you should never shoot anything but M2 ball in the M1s, that they were designed for M2 ball. Well, according to Hatcher, who was in charge of ordnance at that time, that's not correct. The timeline of the ammo for the 30-06, which of course was first used in the 1903 Springfield bolt action rifle, originally it was a 30-03, and it used a 220 grain full metal jacket round nose bullet, similar to the 30-40 Krag that it replaced. But by then, most of the other warring nations around the world had gone to lighter Spitzer bullets at higher velocities and really extended the range of their rifles. So the 30-06 was eliminated. The existing 03 Springfield barrels were set back and rechambered into the 30-06, and the only difference between 30-06 and 30-03 is that the neck is slightly shorter in the 30-06, so that prevents a 30-03 cartridge from being seated in the chamber. The original 30-06 round, which is what we used in World War I, fired a 150 grain flat base Spitzer, looks very much like the M2. The bullets are a different color. They did not have gilding metal at the time, which is a copper zinc alloy. They used what was called cupro-nickel, and they were really almost a silverish color. But that cupro-nickel also was bad, it created bad fouling in the barrel. It was tough to get out. But that was what we fought World War I with. Our soldiers in World War I came back and said, hey, our machine guns didn't have the reach of the enemy. The German 8mm machine guns could reach 1,000 or 1,500 yards further than ours, and that was because their machine gun ammo used a longer, very streamlined, heavier bullet, and that gave it more range. So after World War I, the original 30-06 load was replaced with the M1 ball, and the M1 ball was 174 grain Spitzer boat tail, and it was loaded to about 2,650 feet per second, which the original 150 in the 30-06 was only going 2,700 feet per second, so the 174 was almost up to the velocity of that original 30-06 ammo, because we had developed better powders by that time. And so that M1 round gave our machine guns a lot more reach, so the machine gunners were happy with it. The rifle competitors were not happy with it because it gave substantially more recoil in those 03 rifles when they were out shooting at 600 and 1,000 yards. The other problem was a lot of the National Guard shooting ranges had shorter safety zones than on Army bases, and they found that the M1 ball was actually overshooting the safety zones of some National Guard ranges. At that time, Army Ordnance then developed the M2 ball. They went back to a 150. It used a slightly different lead core, so they ended up weighing 152 grain, flat base bullet. They upped the velocity to 2,800 feet per second because, again, we had developed better powders, and that became the M2 ball. And a lot of people will tell you that you should never shoot anything but M2 ball because that's what the M1 Garand was designed for, and according to Hatcher, that's not correct. And he was in charge of ordnance, so I think he knew. The rifle was developed during the time of the M1 ball with that 174 grain bullet. And that's what the M1 used until that supply of M1 ball was eventually exhausted. That's when the M2 came into production, and of course that's what we fought World War II with. So we've been told along the years that hotter .30-06 ammo will eventually damage an M1. And I don't think that's completely accurate because we've seen, from the .30-06 to the M1 ball to the M2 ball, we've seen it progress in terms of energy and power, and the rifle eats it up just fine. Commercial .30-06 that you buy in the store nowadays is loaded considerably hotter, higher pressures than the M2 ball. And those pressures, the gas is drawn out at the very end of the barrel there, and it drives this long operating rod back to function the rifle. So theoretically, if you're over-gassing the system, if the pressure's higher and the op rod is being hit harder by that gas blow, it could bend the operating rod. The bolt kind of bottoms out at the back of the receiver. That's what stops the rearward motion of it during a cycle. In theory, that could become cracked by repeated use with high pressure loads. That's what we've been told. I've never seen it myself. I'm not an expert in M1s by any means. I've never met anybody who's ever seen an M1 damaged in that way. Another interesting chapter in that Hatcher book is that after World War II, probably they didn't have quite enough to do one week, so they decided to take examples of all the rifles used by, the warring nations in World War II and see how strong they were. And so they would reload cartridges in those various calibers, and they would put faster than normal burning rate powders, and they just kept upping that charge more and more and more until the cartridge blew. Sometimes they're, instead of 48,000 pounds that this is supposed to be, or upwards of 60 for modern cartridges, they were up in the 75, 80, sometimes 90,000 PSI range with those cartridges until the system failed. And interestingly, they said the two strongest rifles used in World War II, the strongest, was the Japanese Arisaka. And if you've ever handled one of those, this is one of the crudest looking rifles you've ever seen made. But apparently the quality of the steel and the design of the lugs and everything, it was an incredibly strong rifle. The second strongest rifle that they almost, again, could hardly get to blow up was the M1 Garand. The quality of the steel was phenomenal. The contact of the lugs was very strong. And they said even when it failed, when the cartridge blew and the system failed, it failed in such a way that they don't think the shooter would have been injured at all. So I think it's complete crap that you're going to blow up an M1 with modern commercial ammunition. You may stress the operating rod more than it was designed for, and you may eventually wear some parts out in that way. But there's one YouTuber that they went to a lot of work with high-speed cameras, and they were measuring the bolt speed with, I think, 60 different cartridges ranging from M2, M1. They found some old M1 ammo and a lot of different commercial loads. And they said the bolt speed, even of the hottest commercial loads, wasn't seriously worse than what the M2 ball produced. So they didn't really think it would cause a problem. If you're concerned about it, you want to shoot modern commercial ammunition, the gas plug can be replaced. There are a couple different designs out there. One has a larger chamber bored into it, which kind of drops that pressure down because it's just going into a larger area. And a couple of the others have a vent. It's kind of a hex key screw that goes in there with a hole in it, and it vents out some of the pressure. And you simply replace parts. You replace, ever smaller plugs to let out less and less powder until you get the function that you want for your particular load. I did carry this as a tool, not a toy, in Wyoming. For a couple of years on patrol, this thing was bouncing around in the back of a four-wheel drive Blazer in a soft case. And what I had done was take some, I think I used Spear 150 grain soft points. The powder used in World War II was IMR 4895, still available. So I worked a load of 4895, got it up to the same velocity. So I was, perfectly safe, but I had those 150 grain spears, and I thought, if I got to put down a range bull that's been hit by a car, or if, somebody crippled an elk, and I need to reach out 100 yards and knock it down, it's going to hit a lot harder than my AR-15. So it did ride on patrol with me for a good many miles out in Wyoming. I never pulled it out. So I guess that's how I would say that it's a tool, not a toy. Finishing up about ammunition, if you want M2 ball, it is still available. I don't believe there's any surplus available, but CMP might get it occasionally. I've seen some Greek stuff come in a number of years ago that was pretty good ammo, so they might get supplies of it. But in terms of commercial, Cellular and Beloit, S&B makes an M2 ball equivalent with a 150 full metal jacket. PPU makes it, and Federal in the United States. And in fact, their box is marked for the M1 Garand, so M2 ball can be had. A little side note, I'm going to show you an ammo can that I have. When I got this rifle, the rifle club out in Wyoming was a DCM affiliated club. So they had a number of M1 Garands and ammunition. And they had, at one point, sponsored high-power rifle competitions out to 600 yards. But they hadn't for several years. So, and I was a member of the club, and I said, hey, I understand you got, M2 ball. I said, can anybody buy it? And yeah, you can. And they had 2 cans left. And I bought both of them. I've gone through one of them over the years, but one of them I kind of set back as my war reserve. When I get to the range portion of this, I'll show you what's in there. This is my M1. I think it's a treasure. If you're a history buff, you're a gun-oriented person, and you've never fired one, you owe it to yourself to get your hands on an M1. If you want one of your own, God bless you. You can get them from Civilian Marksmanship Program. You can buy them at gun shows. A lot of stores have them. They come in all different kind of grades. They come in complete, all original Winchesters and Springfield Armories that are truly collector grade. You can find some out there that look like they've never really been handled. But to my way of doing business, what I like to do with guns, I'd rather have one that's got a few dings and scratches in it, and I'm going to go out and shoot it, and I'm going to have fun with it. And if it ever came to it, and this was the only weapon I had to help defend our country, I think there's some boys out there that could be in trouble. So let's go to the range. We'll pop a few rounds, and I'll show you that can of ammo that I have put back. One kind of interesting thing about these things is you don't really need pouches. They come in the bandoliers and the ammo can. That's okay for slinging over your shoulder. The guys in World War II had battle belts with pouches for those 8-round clips. But you can just stash it over your shirt if you need to. I've seen guys in the war movies, they have them over the sling of their rifle. But I think that sling kind of wobbling back and forth would throw you off when you tried to get some accurate fire. But handy to have there. When I got this rifle, I was working for a sheriff's office in Wyoming, and we routinely had to put down animals hit by cars, injured by coyotes, things like that. And I had an AR-15 racked up between the seats of my Blazer where I could get it very quickly. Sorry for the wind, but this heat wave we're in, we got to shoot when we can. But I thought, that AR-15, as good as it is at putting down small to medium-sized game, if I ever have to put down a range bull that's been injured or an elk or something like that, I need more. So what I did was carry this M1 in the back end. And I had loaded some soft point bullets to World War II type pressure levels. And if you just put 7 in a clip, you can seat it all the way down and let the bolt go forward on the closed chamber. So you got 7 rounds in there, you're ready to go. I've shot this thing for several years. Let's see if I can hit the target. She always lets you know when she's empty. That's kind of handy. Another 8 rounds in, I'm back in the fight. Well, I think these things are pretty cool. The fact that it's an international harvester, which there was a plant in my hometown, that just makes it more special to me. It's really kind of a toy more than a tool. But hey, it's okay to have some tools and some toys in the gun locker at the same time. Worst come to worst, this old gal still works. She'll still put them down. I'd like to take a little time to do a little business. First of all, shameless plug for my book, my second book, Building a Better Gunfighter. I have a number of these in paper copy. They are still available on either eBay or on my website at dickfairburn.com. The first book, Police Rifles, is no longer in print, but both of these will soon be out in an ebook format, so you can pick them up that way. I would also like to ask you to please subscribe, ring the little notification bell, and if you like what I'm doing here, give me a thumbs up. That's what helps grow this channel. That's what helps develop more content for you that are interested in what I want to do. So I appreciate it if you could buy the book, if you can subscribe, ring the bell, and give me a thumbs up. Thank you very much. Okay, here's my last can of War Reserve M2 ball for my M1 Garand. Those of us that think strangely about things like that. I had this CO2 sealed. I opened it up yesterday to make sure everything was still okay. And I'll tell you later about how you can CO2 seal these things for really long-term storage. This came through at Director of Civilian Marksmanship Rifle Club back in 1986, about the last they had. They had not done high-power shooting for a number of years, so they still had a few M1s, but this was the last of their ammo. It's LC69 head stamp. You get 384 cartridges. That is 8 bandoliers, each holding 6 clips with 8 rounds in each clip. These are not the fastest to use, so this would not be my combat expedient here. I'd have other ways to carry them. But I think you can see that this ammo is just as bright and shiny as the day it was made. Perfect storage for this M2 ball. 8 bandoliers, 6 each. 8 rounds per clip, so you get the clips, the ammo, the bandoliers, and all. And it sticks in my mind that if you bought the whole can and you didn't want to bring back the brass and the clips and the other accoutrements, I think it cost me like 50 or 60 bucks for the can. So if only we could buy stuff like that again nowadays. So they fold up like that. Loop them around. And it goes in like that. And that can is full. That's an old 50 size can, but it holds just that perfect amount of M2 30-06 ammunition. When I mentioned sealing with CO2, if you get a little piece of dry ice, and dry ice is nothing more than solid CO2, a lot of times you can get it at grocery stores. If you ask, they've got some in a small cooler somewhere you can buy. Put a couple layers of cardboard or something to protect the ammo from the super cold. Lay a chunk of CO2 on there and let it sublimate, which means go directly from solid to a gas. Do this indoors where there's no wind. CO2 is heavier than air, so that CO2 will settle down into this can and eventually flow over the edges when it's full. You won't see it do that generally, but that's displaced all the air, which means it's displaced all the oxygen. Once that's done, everything's dry. Just ease your lid back down. Slap it in place, and you have 384 rounds in an absolutely oxygen-free environment. And that's how you keep that stuff as bright and shiny as it is now, and it will probably be just as good 50 years from now as it is today. I always said this was my war reserve. When the Russians came, I could grab my M1, grab that can, and I could hold a few of them off. I don't know if the Russians are coming anymore. From the way we've seen them fight in Ukraine, I'm not sure we needed to be all that afraid of them. We were, certainly when I was in the Army, we were deathly afraid of them. So now, I guess, this is my war reserve for when the native-born liberal commies try to take over our country. And worst comes to worst, I got an old rifle and some old ammo that will get their attention. Thanks for watching.
Okay, we got them both here now. You ready? Bud got one. Ginger got one. Oh, she missed it. She usually gets them, doesn't she, Bud? Okay, girl, last one. You ready? You ready? Yeah! That's all there is till next time.